he's reached and grabbed the door, and I'm trying to process what's happening, what's he doing, is he drunk? Carjacking wasn't even in my mind. He started to pull on the door.
All right, gang, check it out. We have a special guest this week for a guest spot. His name is Chris Greenfield. He is the host, I take it, of a new podcast. Talk to us about it, Chris. What do you got going on over there?
Yeah, I'm me and the crew over at Big Tex Ordnance launched a podcast back in September. You know, we'd always have people come by the store or come by the warehouse, or buddies that we know from the training circuit come in, and we'd sit there and talk to them for an hour or 2 hours. We stood around in the warehouse with Steve Fisher one day for an hour and a half and got done, and we just looked at each other and we're like, wow, I wish we could have recorded that and put that on air to share with everybody. And so we moved some stuff around, we moved some offices around, and we set up a really cool, we call it the Pod Lab. And now anytime somebody's in town, we have them come by, we sit down, we talk for an hour, we talk for 2 hours. We'll break that up into hour segments if we need to. We take our equipment on the road with us. We went to Shooter Symposium a couple of weeks ago, and we did 8 or 9 interviews out there. We've already published a bunch of them, but I mean, we sat down and had a conversation with some of the leaders in the training industry, like Steve Fisher, Chuck Pressburg, Jamie Caldwell, you know, some of Jared Reston. I don't know if you had Reston on your show yet.
I have not. No, we don't have a lot of instructors on this show. Maybe he may have been on the Extra channel at some point, but I'm not aware. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he's one of those mindset dudes. You know, the guy got shot in the face like 5 times and finished the fight and won it. And so, like, being able to sit down with those dudes like we normally do and share those stories, those interactions, those laughs with our audience is pretty cool to be able to do it and share it with our audience. You know, we set out to not make it an hour commercial. We rarely talk about products. We rarely, and even if it is, it's a joke. You know,
right.
Like, oh, we just got that in. You can grab it at BigTexOrdnance.com.
That's an aisle 73. It's right down the way there. Check it out.
It's right there. It's right there. If you put it in your cart right now, you'll have it by 2 days from now. But we don't like to do that. We like to share our experiences because not everybody gets to sit down and talk to the dudes we get to sit down and talk to.
Yeah, and I love the idea that it's kind of almost like a fly on the wall kind of thing. Like, you were going to have this conversation anyway. You were going to shoot the bull, shoot the breeze, and bust chops for an hour or so after a training session. So it makes perfect sense that you're gonna, if you record this, people can listen to it, and kind of listen in on what you guys would talk about anyway. It's kind of cool. I like the idea.
Yeah, it's really neat.
What's the name of the show and where can they find it?
The Big Tex Ordnance Podcast. We were very clever.
Yeah, that is clever. I was going to go with the Mike Williver Show, but John insisted we call it the Active Self-Protection Podcast, which is so literal. You know what I mean? It's so literal. It's kind of boring.
It's so funny. The funny thing is, I've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And one day I told my 7-year-old that my middle name was Danger.
For those who don't know, that's my middle name on social media, ladies and gentlemen.
So so she introduces me to everybody as Chris Danger Greenfield.
Well, yeah.
And in fact, she actually leans over and whispers, his name is actually Danger. Yeah. And it's so hilarious. I just thought I'd share that with you.
No, I love it.
That's the stuff. It's real interactions on the podcast. That's what we do. We joke. We have a good time. We share really good information on everything that we do, firearms related, accessory related, that type of thing. And you can find us on Apple, Spotify, like I think it's like 30 or 40 different podcast platforms that we are on currently. And we do a video version that's posted up on YouTube.
Very cool. So folks, go check it out. It's the Big Tex Ordnance Podcast. Did I get that right? It's so hard to remember the name of it.
It's so hard to remember. And you can actually find links to it at bigtexordnance.com as well.
Yes. But folks, here's the important thing Chris wants to make sure you understand. And this is important. It's not an hour-long commercial. It's not an ad to go to this or that training or to buy this or that product. It's just guys sitting around talking training, talking equipment, and really, really important information. Go give them a look. Please go check them out. And if there's a way to do it, make sure you gloat and tell them the Active Self Protection podcast sent you over there to their budding enterprise. Chris, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate you. We'll see you again.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Alrighty, gang. Welcome back to the Active Self Protection podcast. I am still your host, Mike Williver, your favorite former Fed. With us today, a new friend of mine. His name is Mark. He hails from, if I can get this right, Colf Saba, Australia. I'll have him say that in good proper Australian English to help clarify anything. So yes, he's in a relationship. He has one son, and his work will remain a mystery. We're not talking about what he does for a living because he might have to kill you. We don't know. All right. Anyway, Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Excellent, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's definitely a privilege to be on.
So I want to say you're our first international guest. We had a guy, an American, who had an incident in Panama. So I'm not sure that counts. We do have someone coming up from the UK. We have someone coming up from Germany. So the show is going international. It's very exciting. So I'm so glad you reached out to tell us your story. So tell us, what sort of self-defense background do you have, if any? Have you done any sort of training, self-defense, jiu-jitsu, anything like that?
Yeah, so I haven't actually trained for a long time. Years ago, I did a couple of different forms of more traditional martial arts, karate, taekwondo. Did a little bit of jiu-jitsu probably about 8 to 10 years ago, but only a handful of classes. I guess a lot of theory stuff. I do watch a lot of active self-protection videos, those kind of videos about, situational awareness, that kind of thing. But have not trained recently. I go to the gym once a week, so I'm reasonably fit.
Very well. So yeah, not everyone who comes on the show has prior to their incident had a self-defense mindset or background. So I'll be interested to see how that plays into your story. Talk to us really quick. We don't get a lot of Australia news in the States, and the States is like 97% of our listeners are in the United States, and then UK and Canada follow closely behind. Give us a general idea of what is crime like in Australia? Is it an epidemic? Is it a problem? Is it the same as it's always been? Could you kind of characterize that for us?
Yeah, for sure. I think, generally speaking, it's a relatively safe country, or comparatively safe country. I think as with any country, the major cities experience more crime.
Sure.
The higher population densities experience more crime. In my area, I think it's relatively safe. As with all places, I think the methamphetamine problem is playing a role in crimes, and I think there's been probably an increase in petty crimes, but I think there's also an increase, anecdotally, an increase in home invasions, break-and-enters, that kind of thing. And actually, I completely forgot to mention, about 4 months ago, I was staying with my female friend, and someone had tried to get in. We didn't know until the morning. They'd gone down to another unit in the apartment complex, and someone had left their front door open. So they walked in, they helped themselves, and they woke up the homeowner and asked him where he kept his cash. I think they were armed with a screwdriver. So I think that sort of thing is increasing. Generally, I would say it's a safe country. Again, I've never lived in any of the major cities. Around here, it seems to be there's not a lot of publicity for the crimes that happen. So in my particular case, I'd made a comment to the police officer, who would have thought you'd get carjacked in Coffs Harbour.
Right.
And his response was, it happens a lot more than you would think. And I'd never heard of it here. So, I think generally it's a safe, friendly place. But I think, like a lot of places, the crime is increasing.
Yeah, I would be surprised to hear that goes on a lot in a small town. I assume it's a relatively small town in Australia. So I wonder, you may not be able to answer this, but I wonder why it's not getting the publicity that perhaps it should be getting, the awareness raising publicity. You would hope that if it were going on with any regularity, that the police would want the media to tell people, what's going on so they can defend themselves. Any thoughts on why that would be? Why they wouldn't be covering it in the news?
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought about that quite a bit, especially recently. I know that in the local newspaper that doesn't exist in physical form anymore, there used to be a section on crime in the area. And I do know that the local police website, they have, sort of a brief on crimes that have been happening in the area, but it doesn't seem to get a lot of publicity. I think partly, I can't say for certain. I think partly there's, perhaps the idea that we want to continue giving the perception that this is a safe, friendly place. It's definitely a tourist-driven economy. I think that plays a role. I think too, there's a lot of people I speak to, there's a real aversion to having to take responsibility for defending yourself. So I live in a country where you can't own pepper spray, you can't own a taser, you definitely can't carry a gun. You can own a gun for target shooting and hunting, but you just can't carry anything. I think the law states that you can use reasonable and proportionate force to defend yourself, but how you actually go about that is anyone's guess. I mean, if you happen to be, for example, a tradesman and you had a hammer in your vehicle and you use that to defend yourself, that's fine. But if you were to carry a hammer to premeditate self-defense, then I think it becomes an offensive weapon.
So here we go. This is the first time I've ever heard the term premeditated self-defense, but it does sound like something that would be charged with in Australia or the UK. So you have to know, most of the audience here is American. We have people in tens and tens of countries around the world that listen. But for our American audience, it's such a foreign concept, the idea that you couldn't even have pepper spray, or if you were to carry something other than a knife, pepper spray, or firearm for self-defense, that could be somehow an issue or construed as, I don't know, looking for trouble, maybe. So this does lead me to my next question, which is, prior to this sort of, as Americans would view it, draconian sort of gun confiscations that went on in Australia, I don't know all the details. I just know that it's almost impossible to get any kind of a rifle unless it's specifically like a sporting rifle, like a bolt action. So like an AR-15 is strictly forbidden. You cannot possess one. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the case of any semi-automatic firearm, with the exception of handguns, which is a little odd. Any semi-automatic long arm, essentially, it's very, very difficult to have a license issued for one of those. So not to go into a whole nother subject, but when our gun laws came in, they created categories. So category A, B, C, D, and H. Essentially, the average person can get long arms in lever action, bolt action, pump action, but not pump action shotguns. It's very backwards, and the average person who doesn't understand firearms, they think it's reasonable and whatnot, but it's very restrictive, and typically handguns are more restricted, but the odd thing is you can still have semi-automatic handguns for target shooting. So there's a lot of contradiction in the laws, and I think it reflects to the laws were written by people who didn't really have a great understanding of firearms and that sort of thing. And I think as far as firearms laws goes, the average Australian sort of sits on the fence. They don't really care either way. I think the concept of the Second Amendment is really foreign to people here. And as I said,
literally and figuratively, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that it definitely appeals to me. Having a Second Amendment definitely appeals to me. I think a lot of people, they just don't have the experience or the knowledge to really make an assessment on what's safe and what's not, and what's reasonable and what's not. And I think the only time the average person here does see firearms is in the movies,
Mm-hmm.
where they're typically being abused and used for crimes, and it's quite unbalanced. But yeah, it's been like that for a long time.
You said something a moment ago that I think is so important. You said these laws are being written by and crafted by people who don't know very much about firearms, about their use, about how they function, about what the difference between a fully automatic, semi-automatic, and a bolt action. They may have never seen one in real life, like you said, only maybe in the movies. That's not unlike here. When it comes to the people who are anti-gun in the United States, you can Google, go on YouTube, and look up goofy politician giving a speech about guns, and they say the craziest things that aren't true. Most popularly, or most famously, there was an assemblyman in California who held up a normal AR pattern rifle, I think it was, and he's like, "This is a ghost gun, capable," and then he lists these things that it's capable of that are preposterous, and it has I can't remember what he said. It was something ridiculous, like it has a 30,000 round ammo clip or something like that. It was crazy. And then, of course, our president, Joe Biden, who famously said years ago, all you need is a shotgun. And like I tell my wife, if you ever hear a problem outside, just walk outside and fire a couple of rounds of buckshot into the air. It's fine, which is the worst advice I've ever heard in my life. Unfortunately, these are the people that are crafting our laws, and they don't know what they don't know. And I feel a kinship to some other countries. Australia is one of them, I should say. And it breaks my heart that the condition of the public's ability to get stuff to protect themselves, their lifeline, firearm, even just pepper spray, is restricted. It just breaks my heart. So, with that said, I just want to be clear. If you, let's say, we're going to talk about your incident here in a moment. Let's say this incident happened, and the person who tried to steal your car threatened you and said, "I'm going to come find you and kill you, Mark." So now you have this threat, you have this crime that's been documented. Could you then get some kind of a permit to carry a firearm with you, or is it still just not an option?
Yeah, absolutely zero chance. I think a very long time ago, pre 1996. So 1996 is when all these gun laws came in, or most of these gun laws came in. I have heard, I've not verified it, but I think pre 1996 there were some very limited cases where people who were deemed to be at risk could get a concealed carry permit. But I think even then they were issued very, very few and far between.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, zero chance. If this individual had have said, as you just stated, "I'm going to come find you, I'm going to get you," the advice would be to take out what we call an apprehended violence order, which is literally a piece of paper issued by the courts.
Here we call it a restraining order. Yeah, same thing.
Restraining, yeah, absolutely. Which is virtually useless. It's useful after the fact to lay some extra charges on the individual. But yeah, there's zero chance of that happening.
No, Mark, I'm not sure. This could be the same in Australia as it is here in the States. It's as though criminals don't follow the law. And so restraining orders don't restrain them, and laws don't prevent them from breaking laws. It's crazy how much we're alike in that way. The whole thing is so silly. The idea that a government can tell an individual who isn't otherwise a prohibited possessor of a firearm that you're not allowed to carry the tools to protect yourself is, as you said, it's very foreign to me. I can't imagine living in a place like that. I'm sure Australia is a wonderful place. I have friends there. But the idea that the government can at once not be obligated to protect you, by the way, because in the States, technically on paper, the police aren't obligated to protect you from crime, right? And then say, well, and also you can't protect yourself. So good luck, have a good life. So all that leads into the reason why you reached out to us. You had an incident, I guess not that long ago. And why don't you just walk us through what you were doing and where you were and what happened in your own words?
Yeah, great. So I guess it's a little over 3 weeks ago, roughly. So yeah, it was just a regular Saturday night. Myself and my female friend had gone out for dinner in a very, very public, very busy area. Self-defense was probably it was the last thing on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always vigilant, but it wasn't at the forefront of my mind simply because there were so many people around. So we'd had dinner, paid for dinner. It's still daylight. So where we were situated, I won't name the exact place, but it's a strip of restaurants along a very busy road.
Mm-hmm.
We parked over the road in a small car park, and it's a small car park just off the main car park. And my female friend was driving. As we were pulling into the car park, I almost said to her, "Look, we shouldn't park here. It's a bit dark." And I thought to myself, "Look, just don't be paranoid," I guess is what I thought. And it's kind of secluded, even though it's right next to the footpath and it's right next to this, directly over the road from this public area. It's obscured by, I think there's some trees there, some bushes. It's obscured.
Okay.
So, definitely it's somewhere where I wouldn't normally park. So we had dinner, went over, had dinner. It was about 7:20 when we'd finished and walked back over the road. And again, there are people coming and going over the road. There's a crossing right there. People coming and going. On the way back to the car, I was caught up in conversation, and I didn't do what I normally do, which is just have a quick look around the car park before I get back in the car as I'm walking up. Having said that, I don't recall seeing anyone as we were walking back to the car. So as we're walking back to the car, we were just chatting as we do, and so the car belongs to my female friend. It's an almost brand new car, and initially she was going to drive. And I should say for the American listeners, I'm sure you're aware, but the driver's side is on the opposite side.
It's on the wrong side. Yes, go on.
Yeah, on the wrong side. Yeah. And so it was a very, very last minute decision for me to get in and drive. Normally in my car, I'm familiar with everything. I get in, and as soon as I get in, I lock the central locking. It's an older car, so you have to manually lock the central locking. And so we've got in the car, just chatting, and I got oriented. And I don't recall whether I saw someone in the mirror, but as I've reversed the car out, so it has a reversing camera.
Mm-hmm.
It's a brand new car. My car doesn't have those sort of luxuries.
Right. Yeah.
So, and I did spot someone in the rear view camera, and I'd said to my female friend, I'd said, "What's this guy up to?" And I don't know that she really paid much attention, and something was really off. He wasn't really doing anything, but then I'd noticed initially I thought he was trying to get out of the way of me reversing.
Mm-hmm.
But then I noticed he was looking directly at me. And so we've come to the full extent of the reverse. And I've turned to my female friend to say to her, "How do you activate the central locking, or are the doors locked?" Because I've only driven this car probably once or twice before.
So at this moment, you sensed something was going on with this guy, right? That's your spidey senses started to tingle a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, normalcy bias made me think, oh, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially here in Australia, we're constantly taught, we don't need anything for self-defense, and we don't need to worry about that, but we do. So we've backed up. I've said to my friend, "Are the doors locked, or how do you lock these doors?" Or I don't think I actually said it, but that's what I was going to say. And I've turned to my right, to my driver's side window, and this individual had closed the distance in a very short space of time, and he was at the window. So his face was right at the window.
Mm-hmm.
And so I reached over with my left hand and grabbed the inside door handle before anything had happened. But it's sort of a shallow handle. I could only get,
first couple pads of your fingers on there. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And So as this is happening, he's reached and grabbed the door, and I'm trying to process what's happening. What's he doing? Is he drunk? Is he injured? You know, carjacking wasn't even in my mind.
Right.
And then he started to pull on the door, and initially he wasn't pulling very forcefully. And in hindsight, he only had a couple of fingers in the door handle. But then, so we started wrestling for the door. He pulled the door open, and I won't use profanities. I think I said, "What the F are you doing?"
Sure. Reasonable.
Yeah. And then I saw he'd produced a knife. So it was a folding knife. I think it was about a 7 centimeter blade, maybe a little longer. So it was a respectable size blade.
Mm-hmm.
And his words were, "Get out of the effing car."
Let me stop you right there.
And
I think this is an important lesson
Sure.
because, you know, Stephanie talks all the time on the main channel and in her classes about radically accepting reality. And I added rapidly, meaning, and I always use the example, if you're a high school student, especially in the United States, and you hear loud bangs in the hallway and screaming, no one is setting off fireworks. That's not what that noise is. It's almost certainly someone shooting up your school, and you need to realize that, accept it, and act accordingly as quickly as you possibly can, and not waste a second or two, because a second or two is an eternity in a defensive encounter, as you now know. So I'm just wondering, was it until you saw the knife and heard him say that you go, okay, this is what I was worried it is? It is actually carjacking. Were you still trying to rationalize that in your head? Like, okay, maybe he thinks this is his car or whatever. Like, did it take until that moment for you to go, okay, this is happening?
Yeah, I think it did. Once I saw the knife, I'd realized what was happening. But as you say, there was, even with myself being quite switched on, there was this inability to accept that it may have been something extremely sinister. Not inability, but just through cognitive, normalcy bias.
Refusal, I think is the word you're looking for.
Yeah.
I've been there.
You know, this doesn't happen in my country,
Mm-hmm.
you know, this kind of thing. And yeah, once I saw the knife, that changed very quickly. And so at this point, I'm in the car seat, I'm buckled in, and he's standing very close. He's within the door, so there's zero chance of getting the door closed again. And I think one thing that I've looked back on, so I wasn't familiar. I'm not familiar with the car, so I don't have that muscle memory to quickly knock it into drive or
Right.
reverse, or whatever. So that was a detriment. You know, in hindsight, there may have been the option to accelerate sharply or reverse sharply. Another thing too with this particular car, I've noticed previously when you accelerate sharply. Just tell me if I'm going too far off track.
No,
Mike.
not at all. You're great. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So I have noticed previously with this car, when you accelerate sharply, there's a real lag. It doesn't, I think it's a traction control feature.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take off sharply. It's a gradual acceleration. And I guess too, my concern was this guy, he was really he was agitated, but he was quiet. You know, as you would well know, criminals don't want to make noise. They don't want to attract attention to themselves.
Right.
So I was concerned that, you know, at this point, anything I did could really, really cause me a problem. And I'm still trying to process and assess, you know, what do I do? What's reasonable?
All right. So, Mark, this guy's inside the door pocket of your car. So if you're at home wondering what that means, imagine you are sitting in your driver's seat and it's on the wrong side of the car, and your driver's door is open and someone is standing between the door and the frame of your car. So you can't close your door. They're in the way. So I have to ask, at this moment, in my mind's eye, if I'm getting a mental rep in personally from your story, it's where's my firearm and can I draw it effectively? Have I practiced drawing from a seated position, drawing from wearing a seatbelt, that sort of thing? Or if any other weapon you could have possibly had, obviously in Australia you can't have anything, literally anything. But let's say you're able to carry a gun or a knife or pepper spray, would you, in this moment, would you be thinking to yourself, okay, let me get to one of these, or would you have just proceeded the way that you did having been unarmed? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, look, I think so. I think, because I've gone over this in my head, I think a primary thought would be, if I use this, if I hurt this guy, or if I use this, pull it out and use it, I'm going to be in so much trouble.
Wow.
In terms of legal trouble, particularly if the individual was hurt. There seems to be, it's not uncommon, I guess. I mean, this is anecdotal, so I'm not quoting from statistics or anything, but it seems to be not uncommon for someone defending themselves to then have charges laid against them for excessive force or, physical injury to the individual. So I think an overriding thought would be, yeah, I could be in so much trouble. This could ruin my life.
Okay, so let's play that out one more step. So let's say the hypothetical situation. This is happening, but Mark is carrying, say, a knife. So he's force on force. He's got another knife on him. So now, once this guy reaches in the car and puts the knife into your stomach a couple of times, are you still going to be wondering if you're going to get in trouble? Or are you going to just do what you have to do to protect yourself? You know what I mean? That's the larger point here being, I don't like that Mark can't defend himself, that he can't arm himself with anything, and that the government. Oh, wait a minute. Does this story end with 2 police officers materializing out of nowhere and grabbing this guy and taking him to jail? Did that happen?
Unfortunately not.
Oh,
unfortunately not.
Who could have seen that coming? So yeah, this is not unlike, in a different way, but in a similar way, police officers in the United States after the last few years of defund the police, and I'm sure you've heard a little bit about that over there, and the morale being down, because once you start telling people you can't defend yourself or you can't do your job effectively as an officer, they're going to hesitate, and we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of officers getting hurt, and waiting and worrying about. You can see the gears turning in their head on these badge cams, worrying about, if I do this, then what? If I have to deploy my firearm, am I going to be raked over the coals? Am I going to be pilloried in the public square? And there's like a 50-50 chance you will be. There's shootings that John and I have covered that are so justified it's preposterous, and there's still outcry in the community. So I guess it's not that different from what the police are going through over here. And I'm sure there's people in the States who carrying a gun or whatever would be hesitant as well. They'd be worried about what happened, but not like what you're talking about. You know what I mean? To where it's almost guaranteed it's going to become an issue that you defended yourself against a hardened criminal. So go back to where we were. He's inside of your door pocket, as I call it. What gear are you in, and what do you do next? Are you in reverse or drive, I guess is my question.
So I think at the time I was still in reverse, and as I mentioned, not being thoroughly familiar with the car, not having all that muscle memory, I don't know for certain whether I'd knocked it into park, whether it was still in reverse. I have a feeling it was still in reverse. So he's inside, as you said, the door pocket, and he started to become more aggressive with his words. So it's the same phrase, get out of the effing car.
Mm-hmm.
But he was more agitated. And I remember thinking at this point, I'm not gonna get out of the car because my female friend's in the car. And I felt that under all that stress, number one, I'm not confident that we can both get out at the same time and that she can be clear of the car when
Mm-hmm.
he gets in. Second to that, I felt that he was so agitated that it's quite possible me getting out would have got me stabbed anyway.
Right.
I felt that at least being in the car seat, if he had have moved on me, I could have unbuckled my belt, put my legs up, and kicked him, from the seated position. And I guess that's a really good point to make. From the seated position, I felt like there wasn't a lot I could do.
Right.
And I get the impression this guy had done this before because he was very quick. He knew when to move in. Whilst he was aggressive, he was very quiet. So I think at this point I'd started demanding him to back away from the car, being as loud as I could. And so at this point, there was a standoff. So there was probably I don't know, maybe a 10 to 15 second period there where I thought, this is it. This guy is going to move in. I've got to go hand to hand with this guy. I'm going to get stabbed. And so, in a very short space of time, the thoughts that were going through my head were, am I going to get slashed? Am I going to get stabbed? How bad is it going to bleed? Am I going home? That kind of thing, in a very, very short space of time. And I think it probably was about 10 to 15 second, a 10 to 15 second period where there was this sort of standoff. I wasn't backing down. He was repeatedly demanding us to get out of the car. And it's probably worth noting too, he definitely wanted the car. He was not interested in cash, phones, wallets. He wanted the car. So at this point, my female friend did probably one of the best moves of the night. She's reached over and pressed on the car horn as I started to yell at this guy. And she sat on the car horn and blasted it over and over. And I remember he got this look on his face, so irritated and frustrated. And I don't know whether, again, I yelled at him to get back. So he's, at this point, with the blasting of the horn and me making all this noise, I think it was taking too long for him and attracting too much attention. He's turned and started to walk away. And, I made a lot of mistakes that night. And I think one of them was what I've done next, which is I got out of the car because I just had this really overwhelming compulsion to see this guy arrested. I didn't want him walking away and getting away with this and doing it to someone else.
Right.
So I got out of the car. His back was to me, and I'd started yelling at the top of my voice to him, drop the weapon, put it on the ground, drop your knife, put it on the ground, over and over and over. Because, number one, as I said, I just didn't want this guy walking off and doing it to someone else. But secondly, there were so many people around, and I wrongly made the assumption that someone would come and help me arrest this guy. I really wanted to, my thoughts were, and it was probably a little irrational given that I wasn't armed, that we could arrest this guy or incapacitate this guy, hold him until the police got there. So he's walked away from the car, and he's walked back down to the public road, the footpath directly opposite this restaurant strip where everyone's eating outside. So once we got down there, I switched over to yelling, "He's got a knife, call the police," because I left my phone back in the car with my female friend. Again, I think that was a mistake to leave her in the car. Sensibly, I should have just closed the door and locked all the doors. And I think it comes back to something that I've heard yourself and John speak about, which is that emotional fitness. I think my ego definitely played a role in getting out of the car and challenging this guy. It was a really dumb thing to do, I think. But carrying on, he got down to the footpath, and this is a highly visible, highly public area. And I'm screaming like drill sergeant volume, drop the knife, put it on the ground, switching over to call the police. He's got a knife, call the police. He's got a knife. He's got a weapon, call the police. Probably one of the most upsetting things for me about the whole night was that no one wanted to get involved. So there were people, for me, within arm's reach. I could have high-fived them, and they just ignored me. I even turned to one gentleman and I said, "Have you got a phone? This guy's just tried to carjack me. Can you call the police?" And his only words were, "No, sorry, mate." That was it.
Wow. Wow. That's astounding.
Absolutely. In psychology, we talk about the bystander effect, and people can Google that. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Mike. It was a classic example of this. And once I'd followed the guy probably for about 50 meters, he was moving up into a dark area. No one was helping me. So I thought, I'm going to go back to the car and call the police. When I got back to the car, thankfully, there was a young couple standing at the car with my female friend. They had heard me yelling, and they were on the phone to the police. They were midway through a phone call. And as good a job as the police do, and they were all fantastic, and they were really great. They were great to me and my female friend. Very helpful and understanding. As we all know, they're not there. They don't magically appear when you need them. They come 10 minutes after the incident's finished.
Yeah, it's not unlike here. It really isn't unlike here. You know, having been a cop for a long time, I can tell you that most cops would love to be everywhere at once and be able to prevent the crime, but that's just not, well, it's not their function, for starters. Proactive law enforcement here, I think, has dipped significantly in the last few years for the same reasons I mentioned earlier, because cops are demoralized. So he ends up, I assume at the end of this, he ends up getting away at that night, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so, and the police come. Walk us through that interaction. That you call the cops, they show up how long after this guy beats feet?
So I think it would have been 8 to 10 minutes when they arrived. And again, you know, everything I've said is no criticism of the officers. They were fantastic and they were really motivated. But as you say, it's just not their function. It's not physically possible for them to be everywhere, you know, unless you carry an officer around in your car with you, you know. So
no one wants to do that.
Absolutely. So, you know, the police, there were multiple cars on scene in, 8 to 10 minutes. Detectives were very quickly on scene. And I should mention they apprehended the guy the next day, according to local media. It was an online newspaper article. I believe it was an off-duty officer who made the arrest, probably about 20 minutes outside town, just in a smaller town. So, it was great. They caught him. According to the newspaper, he was refused bail, which is also great. And I think, I don't know. There was a comment made that we shouldn't probably expect too much of the court system because it's a mess at the moment. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find a location in the world where that isn't the case to some extent.
Yeah, it is here for sure.
Yeah. So, I don't know what's going to happen ultimately, but it was a real eye-opener for me. I think my reasons for coming and having a chat with you, number one, it's something that's always interested me. I've been a fan of yourself and John and the channel for some time, and it's really interesting stuff. But I think I'm hoping that something good can come out of it. Particularly for Australians, I think there's a real disconnect for Australians when we're watching these American channels or European channels, and we do feel a bit insulated. And it's not to make everyone scared and paranoid. It's just to, I think, make everyone realize that yes, you do need to be responsible for your own safety. Saying that we don't need self-defense because we have police, to me, is analogous to saying we don't need first aid kits because we have ambulances. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, there's a famous comparison. I think it was Lieutenant Colonel Grossman that said, you're more than happy to have fire extinguishers, fire alarms, sprinklers, and fire drills in your kid's school, but you don't want someone there with a gun because that's just, it's not going to happen here. There's a million ways in which the human brain minimizes these threats and tries to make us feel better. So let me ask you this. I know this has only been less than a month since this happened, but have you experienced any sort of nervousness, anxiety, PTS, anything like that as a result of this? Parking at night, stuff like that, anything?
Yeah, it certainly has dampened a little bit from the first week, but, definitely, I'd probably refer to it as natural PTS. Being in public is a little more uncomfortable than usual. There was a case probably 3 or 4 days after the incident where I was in a public place and someone was, they looked really agitated and they were walking really quickly. And that was it. That made me very uncomfortable. They were coming towards me. You know, definitely, there's definitely some hypervigilance there, more nervousness than usual. I've noticed, getting in and out of my car, whether it's daylight or not. I'm scanning more regularly. I'm scanning all the time, which, I mean, it's something that I used to do anyway, and I think I'd let my guard down. But yeah, certainly, there is certainly a bit more vigilance and nervousness there. I remember I think it was 1 or 2 days after the incident, I was having dreams about fighting people. And it was...
It never happened before?
Sorry?
It never happened before? You never had those kinds of dreams?
No, not that specific, not that specific. I never dreamt about these. It was a very specific situation where it was really representative of what happened. So the dream was that an individual had come up to me and was talking to me and was really agitated and started to, become really aggressive, and I couldn't make that determination in the dream. Couldn't make that determination of what was going on, and was this a threat? Was it directed at me? And then, I don't recall in the dream if the person had a knife, but we were sort of wrestling, and I remember not really being able to process it. It was that same feeling, that I had in the situation, and I'm sure I'm not speaking outside of what I should, but I know my female friend is, it's been quite hard on her. She lives by herself.
Of course.
It's certainly had an impact on both of us, and I think that's something that people should be aware of too. When we're put in a position where we're not allowed to defend ourselves, or we don't have the tools to defend ourselves, it's a really awful feeling. And that, for me, that feeling has persisted. It's lessening over time. And not to jump around to different topics while I'm thinking of it, so it's a really interesting thing, talking about self-defense in this country. A comment that someone made to me, I don't know, it was probably about 6 months ago or a year ago, and there must have been something in the media about pepper spray or self-defense. And I said to someone, so if you were able to carry pepper spray, would you carry pepper spray? And the response from this individual was, we shouldn't even have to have this discussion about should I have to carry pepper spray. So their logic was, I shouldn't have to do it, so I'm not going to do it. And I guess it's like anything. We shouldn't have to talk about child molestation, but we do. It's just one of those things.
Or school shootings, or any number of unpleasant things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And but it has been interesting after this. Speaking with a handful of people, maybe 10 people, I've asked them the question: if pepper spray was legal, would you carry it? And most of them have said yes. Most of them have been younger. Probably 50% younger females, couple of males. But another good thing that's come out of this, I have teed up a meeting with a local member of parliament, and I do want to discuss with him, number one, why is pepper spray still prohibited? Can we do something to have it legalized for people?
That's a worthy meeting. I hope that works out. And do me a favor, once you've had that meeting, shoot me an email and let me know what they told you, because I'll be curious to know. Maybe update our listeners as to how that conversation went, if that's something you'd want to do. So let's talk about lessons. I mean, first of all, don't live in a country where it's illegal to defend yourself. Okay, well, you can't do anything about that. You live in Australia. So save that. You mentioned a couple times about the car, and I think this is so interesting. And it's another one of those little layers of lessons that we don't foresee coming to light, but it did. You're in an unfamiliar car, and so maybe you don't know, is the parking brake on the floor, or is it is it a handbrake, or where is the central locking button, or where are the window buttons, or God forbid it starts raining, how do I turn the windshield wipers on? just a training point. So if you're in a new car, let's say you get a rental car or something, just take a minute and familiarize yourself. Now, with that said, I speak from experience. My wife and I both have kind of similar, smaller SUVs, right? Uh, one's a Toyota, one's a Mazda, and the Mazda is newer and it has this adaptive cruise control. I don't know if you've heard of this, but I'm sure they have it in Australia, to where you set the cruise control on the freeway.
We're a bit backwards here. We don't have that.
Well, you're upside down for starters.
Well,
I mean, let's just start there. And then you set the cruise control, and it senses the car in front of you, and it slows you down and speeds you up according to the vehicle in front of you. It can sense the lanes to make sure you're not leaving your lane. And we'll drive that, from Arizona to California and back, and then I get back and I get in my older Toyota that doesn't have that, and I set the cruise control, and I almost rear end somebody because the car's not slowing down by itself. So I think no matter how much you practice, there's always a possibility you're gonna have a brain hiccup and forget exactly how to lock the doors or whatever. But familiarize yourself with that stuff to the extent that you can. Another thing worth mentioning, I don't think I mentioned this before either, a lot of modern cars will have settings buried in the settings menu of the touchscreen or whatever that enable you to set when the locks automatically lock and unlock. And it's something to think about, because if you pull up to a situation and there's criminality afoot or something crazy is going on, and you throw it into park, you need to know, are all my doors going to unlock on their own or aren't they? That's something to think about. Same thing with lock. A lot of cars will lock the doors when you put it into drive or reverse. Some it's when you get to 5 miles an hour or 15 miles an hour. So just something to try to familiarize yourself with. Although I totally understand this is the one time you're driving this car, you weren't thinking, oh, let me, like I'm in a theater, let me find the emergency exits and count the stairs and, let me find out where the locking button is. But this is something that our listeners are now getting a mental rep. They're hearing this happened to them. So it's something they can now think about. Keep your phone with you if you can. We had another guest on who had an intruder in her home, and she left her phone on the bed and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And then all of a sudden wished she had it on her person. So he said, you left your phone in the car. And now you're relying on the kindness of others to help you out by calling the police, and they couldn't even be bothered to do that. That's not an Australia thing. That's a human condition thing, unfortunately, with the bystander syndrome. And then if you can go back and do this over again, how long would you say it was from when you got out of the car to when you stopped pursuing this guy or he got away from you? About how much of a distance? Just give me a wild estimate. Or how many minutes or how many seconds?
Probably a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes.
So you followed him for quite a bit. So I think the question is, I think you did what you thought was the right thing to do in the moment. If I had to guess, you were thinking to yourself, okay, well, he's moving away. I'm yelling at him. Let me get him as far away from my lady friend as I possibly can. I'm sure that's what's going through your head in the moment. I'm sure most men would feel the same way. Call me a sexist. But consider how long you want to do that. If you're in this position, especially if the suspect is armed and you're not, how long do I want to continue to follow? If he's far enough away, can I make a break, get back to my car or get back in my house or whatever the case might be? So if you can go back and do anything differently, obviously, aside from memorize the controls of your girlfriend's new car, which is not going to happen. Is there anything else you might have done differently or changed, or might you have illegally carried a weapon? I know people here that do it all the time just because they can't legally carry a firearm. So they break the law. What would you do differently if you could do something differently now? Or is there anything? Maybe there's nothing.
Yeah, look, I think, following my own rule of always locking the central locking as soon as I get in, I think that was probably the one time in months that I hadn't done it. And having the central locking secured, having the car secured, it would have changed everything dramatically,
Don't think for 1 second, by the way, that your boy wasn't paying attention and listening for that locking sound. I guarantee you, if he's that good at carjacking, because if he heard it lock, he'd have moved on to somebody else, probably.
That's a really, really good point. That's a really good point. As you say, if they know what they're doing, they're looking for these things. Well, I'd like to think that I would probably keep my ego in check and not get out of the car. I would slam that door shut and lock it and then call the police. I think that, practically and tactically, that's a much better thing to do. Lock the door, mm-hmm. You're secure, you're safe. We're both safe. We have a car, we're in a car, in hindsight, I guess I would try try to. I mean, it's impossible to say whether I could do this, but I would try and process it a bit more quickly. Accept that
Sure.
this is an armed robbery, this is a carjacking. I need to do something. Something, something that I would change. I wouldn't wear. I think you guys call them flip flops, thongs. We call them thongs here. Yeah, I had thongs on, and I felt that really impeded my ability. I couldn't really run, and it probably impeded my ability to. I felt that it would be more awkward to throw kicks, to move around on. So it was an asphalt surface, to move around freely and quickly and do things. I think wearing joggers is a much better option practically. Going over it, locking the doors, staying in the car, not making the assumption that people would help me. I've always been very practical and always said to people, look, if you want to take care of yourself, you've got to do it yourself.
Right.
And I guess, I did rely on the goodwill of others and learned a pretty harsh lesson. I don't think there's anything else that I would really do differently. It was such a high intensity, compressed, short space of time. I can't think of anything else that, if it was legal to carry pepper spray, absolutely pepper spray, taser, extendable baton, are certainly options that I would have liked to have had, especially if this guy had have started stabbing me. And I guess that's another thing to point out. If I had being, if I was being stabbed to death, I'm not confident that those different noises that I undoubtedly would have been making would have garnered any attention from people standing by. I don't think they would have come help. They may have called the police. I just don't feel that someone would have come and helped me physically fight this guy.
If they're not calling the police when you're screaming at the top of your lungs, drop the knife, I'm going to go out on a limb, and if to hear your death rattle, you're gurgling in the car, no, probably not. They probably would have just, kept going the other way. So, folks, I don't want to put you off the idea of vacationing in Koh Saba, Australia, because it seems like a lovely place, and Mark's a lovely guy. I do want you to stay tuned for Stephen Gutowski coming up after this. We'll have some interesting news to talk about. Folks, remember something. If you're in the United States, you live in an amazing and very unique place that we cherish our freedoms and our rights. But remember, those rights come with responsibilities. So if you are going to avail yourself of your right to carry a firearm, I highly encourage you to get training. I highly encourage you to seek out knowledgeable instructors and make yourself familiar with that weapon, because you're hearing today a story of someone who has no possible availability to protect himself legally with any kind of weapon, never mind a firearm. So cherish that Second Amendment. Let's protect it. And Mark, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. Your insights were super valuable, and I will talk to you soon. Give us an update about what happens when you meet your member of parliament, please.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. And I do want to say just a very quick thank you. It's definitely been a great experience and a privilege to come and have a chat with you.
Absolutely. If I ever do make it to Australia, I'm going to look you up.
Fantastic. That'd be great.
All right. Take care, Mark. Alrighty, gang. Welcome back to the Gutowski Files, starring Stephen Gutowski, who is the founder of TheReload.com and the host of the weekly Reload podcast. It was a long episode. It's going to get longer because we're going to talk about the election results, or such as we know them at this point. We're recording this on Wednesday, November 9th. You're going to hear this, the soonest will be the following Friday. So some of these things may have been decided by then, not the least of which is some races out west where apparently people in my home state of Arizona and some people in Oregon and Nevada are having some arithmetic issues counting, and they're just not getting it done in a timely fashion. Other places have gotten this done. I don't know what the problem is, but there's so much to talk about. Stephen, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I think the problem is you West Coasters, just very slow-paced people.
We're laid back, man. We're laid back. Yeah. Siesta culture, baby. That's
like,
how we do it.
We could finish counting these votes. We could stay up and keep counting them until we're done, or we could take like 12 hours off and come back maybe tomorrow night.
You want
we'll
them
finish
fresh.
up.
You want them counting.
Who needs to know?
You don't want them counting all tired and sleepy and making mistakes. I guess I have no idea. I'm frustrated as you are about it.
Process just kind of sucks.
Indeed,
it's the reality.
So first we're going to talk about some Senate races, and in particular where the NRA spent some money and kind of what we know at this point about that. So let's talk about Arizona. You told me before we started that apparently the NRA did help Blake Masters in his primary campaign, but did not seem to continue supporting him, or at least not with as much money during the general election. So what was that about?
No, that was Peter Thiel.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Republican billionaire. The NRA spent money on him in the general election.
Okay.
And they spent money in six different races. I apologize.
Yes.
I got tongue tied there, but 6 different battleground races across the country in the Senate, because they're clearly trying to capture the Senate. That seems to be the NRA's big goal this election cycle. And so they spent in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And now we know the outcome as of Wednesday afternoon here on the East Coast of 3 of those races, which is Wisconsin, the NRA-backed Republican held on, Ron Johnson. Pennsylvania, the NRA-backed Republican lost.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Oz, he lost to Fetterman. And in North Carolina, the NRA-backed Republican won as well. That was Bud. And so we've got 3 races. They're 2 out of 3 right now. But so we don't really know how well they did yet, because we still have 3 other races
right,
where we either don't have an answer or it's going to a runoff. In Georgia, we know what what we know, at least, is that neither one of the candidates is going to get to 50%. It looks like Warnock, the incumbent Democrat there, who supports, assault weapons ban and so forth, is going to probably finish ahead of Walker, the challenger, the Republican, the former football player,
mm-hmm.
The one that probably everybody has heard news stories about and stuff throughout the race. But he's going to finish ahead, Warnock, but he's not going to be above 50%, which is what you need in Georgia to avoid a runoff. There's a libertarian candidate who got 2% of the vote. So just like 2020, if everybody remembers that, Georgia's going to have a runoff election that will probably decide control of the Senate,
mm-hmm.
most likely. But we won't know exactly how that plays out for control of the Senate either until Arizona, where you are, and Nevada finish their vote counts. By Friday, when this goes up, we probably will have an answer. But for right now, it's still unclear exactly how well the NRA has done. I would say the gun control groups, largely spent in the same races as well. They did expand a little bit more to some House races, to some Secretary of State races in places like Michigan and Arizona. I believe the one in Michigan has been settled in favor of the Democrat. But they spent, for instance, every town spent a lot of money in Colorado's state Senate race, one of their key state Senate races, which Republicans did not have a good night in Colorado, so they prevailed there. You had a couple of House races that the gun control groups are trying to protect as well, like Representative Lucy McBeth in Georgia, who won re-election. But not all these were very competitive races anyway, even when people thought there was going to be, a huge red wave. Instead, we seem to be getting sort of Republicans are going to take control of the House and might still capture control of the Senate, but it's not going to be, 20 or 30 seat swing like, people had expected.
Yeah, it's more of a stream really than a wave. Gentle stream.
It's not as though Democrats are going to retain control of the House. They might retain control of the Senate. But as far as midterms go, the way things look right now, and we still have a lot of these tight races that we need to get final counts in, but it looks like Democrats did better than expected, which is a big deal in politics. The expectations game is a big thing. So we'll and that's a lot of the way you read how these races went too,
sure,
is based off the expectations of how things were going to go. That's why the Republicans might capture both the House and Senate and still be viewed as having a pretty bad night because it wasn't by the margins they expected to win by.
Yeah, and
right?
to be clear, I feel like both the Democrats and Republicans were kind of expecting a red wave election that didn't materialize. I think the Democrats were expecting to get pummeled and were surprised to not get pummeled nearly as badly as they had anticipated.
Right, and so expectations game is a really big deal when you're talking about how political strategists view things, how for instance, issues are going to be handled in future elections will come down a lot to how well they did versus expectations last time around. That's why we did an election preview over at the Reload, and I'm sure by the time this goes to air, I'll have another one written up on how things actually turned out.
Mm-hmm.
But it was based a lot on expectations. Another area we had some insight into how did gun politics play in this, because a lot of races didn't come down to guns. Guns were not a big part of the campaign. Even in a lot of these races that the NRA was spending money in, guns were not even like a top 3 issue in a lot of those campaigns. And so you got to look elsewhere to try and glean something from what this election means for gun policy. And one of the easy places is ballot initiatives. Now, like those 3 Senate races, we still don't have the full results in Oregon's gun control ballot initiative,
mm-hmm.
which would put a new requirement for a permit to purchase guns in place. It would also ban even the possession of ammunition magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and do a number of other new restrictions on gun ownership in that state. Right now it's winning, but the AP has it at 50.7% in support and 49.3% opposed. So it's obviously extremely close. There's only 67% reporting as we're recording this. So we'll probably have an answer on that by the time this goes live. But
mm-hmm.
Even if that does pass, what you have to look at is, Oregon is a very deep blue state, and you might expect a strict gun control ballot initiative to pass. And if it doesn't pass by a very convincing margin, you're probably going to see people be less enthusiastic about trying the same tactic in other states that aren't as deeply blue,
sure.
right? Because they'll lose. Similarly, in Iowa, where we do have actual final results, there was a pro-gun ballot initiative, which added the language of the Second Amendment to the state's constitution, the right to keep and bear arms.
I like that, yeah.
Plus, it added the clarification or explicit statement that it's an individual right and that courts should use strict scrutiny whenever scrutinizing state gun
cases,
laws.
Yeah.
So, it's actually kind of a nerdy addition there, but it's a pro-gun ballot initiative, and it passed with 65% of the vote, which actually has it running ahead of the popular incumbent senator there, Chuck Grassley, who won his reelection, but not with the same proportion of votes, which means that some of the people who voted for the Democrat running against Grassley also voted for this ballot initiative, which give you some insight into how well the policy did. Now it's Iowa, so it's a red state, but that's something that people will look at and use to try and determine how gun politics is playing, in not just in Iowa, but perhaps regionally in the area or even nationally. Same thing for some of these gubernatorial elections, right? There were 3 gubernatorial elections that had guns as perhaps not the top issue, but one of the top issues,
mm-hmm.
top 3 issue, right? And those were Texas, Georgia, and New York. Now, in all 3 of those races, the incumbent ended up winning. But something can be gleaned from how much they won by versus what the expectation would be in that state, right? So look at Texas, right? You look at Texas and New York. Those are one's a red state and one's a blue state. So you'd expect the incumbent Republican to win in Texas, which he did, and you'd expect the incumbent Democrat to win in New York, which she did. However, the incumbent Republican in Texas won by 11 points over.
That's a creaming. That's a pummeling.
Yeah, and look, that's over a high profile candidate with a lot of backing. Beto O'Rourke was the candidate. He's famous for saying, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s, your AK-47s. And he didn't, he while he was flip-flopping on that position occasionally during the campaign, he really did kind of embrace that idea and embrace gun control as a significant part of his campaign, a central theme.
He's also famous for losing political races in Texas, by the way. I hope he keeps running just into perpetuity in Texas, please, Beto.
Yeah, it's his third major race that he's lost. He lost against Ted Cruz by a smaller margin,
right?
So that's another thing too. Like he actually performed worse against Greg Abbott, even in the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting. Even with Greg Abbott signing, permitless gun carry and not instituting any new gun restrictions after Uvalde, and O'Rourke making that a major campaign issue, he did worse than he did against Ted Cruz. And 11 points is pretty significant, even especially because there's long been a argument that Texas is moving more blue over the years. That's why people get excited about somebody like Beto O'Rourke, because they think he's the guy who could push them over that tipping point to be a blue, to have more democratic statewide officials. It's just that he's failed at each time he's tried it. But then you look at New York, right? And yes, Kathy Hochul won. She used the Everytown playbook towards the end of her campaign when things had tightened up, which was to connect gun control with crime, as sort of an anti-crime message, try to use gun control as an anti-crime message. And she pulled off the race. There were polls that showed a lot of tightening towards the end of that race. That there was even a poll from a major pollster that showed Zeldin ahead, her opponent. But she ended up winning. However, she only won by about 5 points, it looks like. And for a Democrat in New York, where they haven't elected a Republican governor since the 19th century, I believe.
Yeah, that was Pataki, right? Was the last one?
I can't recall.
Yeah, I think it was Pataki, but that was like early 2000s.
The point is, it's been a very long time since they. Perhaps I got the date wrong. Either way, it's been a very long time since they elected a Republican governor. There's been Republican mayors of New York City and stuff, but the governorship has been Democratic for a very long time. And she only won by 5 points. That gives you, that's another indication that, well, she didn't perform that well. And it's not just gun policy, right, that was at play in that race. It's not what Zeldin was focused on, but it was what Hochul focused on. And so you look at that and you think, well, she underperformed, and so maybe what her strategy was didn't work very well. These are the kind of things that people that political operatives take from these races, like other campaigns. When they look at how these races went, these are the sort of conclusions. These are the signs they're going to look at for what conclusions to draw. And then you have Georgia, right, where the incumbent Republican governor won, and Georgia's a much more divided state. It's a much more purple state, and to have the governor pull off what looks to be about a 8 point, I think it's a 9 point win. That's pretty impressive. And he's running against, again, another very well-known, well-funded opponent in Stacey Abrams. Brian Kemp held off Stacey Abrams again as their rematch race. And that race was focused on guns, at least as a top 3 issue. Again, it's not necessarily the top issue, but it was something where Abrams used Kemp's signing of permitless gun carry as a significant issue in the race. There was a festival that got canceled in Atlanta because of people would have been allowed to carry firearms legally, and that became a campaign issue as well. Abrams brought this up a lot, and Kemp didn't shy away from the issue. So him winning and wildly outperforming the Republican Senate candidate there, that tells people stuff as well. I think. And again, this stuff's not always crystal clear. The ballot initiatives, it's a little easier to just read them because it's like people are just directly voting on the question of a certain gun policy. So it's pretty easy to interpret. The rest of this stuff, obviously, you got to take into account. I mean, think about the Kemp race, right? That's a race where you've got a very conservative Republican governor who is hated by the former Republican president and has been dealing with, the fallout from that for years, but also has governed the state in a really, conservative manner, passing, a bunch of policies that Republicans like. He opened up the state earlier than even former President Trump had wanted back in 2020. And, there's all this other stuff that's going on. Stacey Abrams refused to acknowledge that she lost the previous election. You have obviously the issue of abortion was big in that race as well. And, there's a lot going on in each of these races. But that's where, things get a little more complicated to look at. Like, how does this affect the politics of guns? Well, it's easy to say, well, all right, the Iowa ballot initiative passed. So in Iowa, that's pretty simple calculation to make. Or Oregon, maybe this ballot, the gun control ballot initiative passes there, and you can say, well, okay, in Oregon, they want this sort of policy. Now, obviously, there's complications that come after that with the legal case against, something like the ballot initiative in Oregon. But the political side of things, it's a little more straightforward. When you get out into, the NRA spent a lot of money in the Wisconsin Senate race, or for instance, the NRA spent a lot of money in the Pennsylvania Senate race, but didn't. A lot of their ads didn't even talk about guns. So how much influence did the gun politics have on that race? You got to make a little more of a reasoned inference at that point. And so people can disagree, but these are the ways that your political operatives are looking at these races and what they're taking away from them in a lot of cases. And, overall, so far is a fairly good night for gun policy, but for an issue that has been a sort of back burner issue in the election generally, right now what I think you're seeing is a pretty good performance in the key races where it was a significant issue. You have Hochul in New York, but again, she really underperformed for a Democratic incumbent. Well, I mean, this is her first time being elected in an actual election because the whole Cuomo scandal is the way she got into office in the first place. But regardless, she didn't do great, even though she did win. And there'll be other races. I think the Lauren Boebert race in Colorado will be an interesting one. She's trailing right now. There hasn't been a final call on that one yet. She's obviously a very prominent figure in Republican gun circles. Is certainly one of the things that she has made a sort of one of her main calling cards in her time in Congress, and she's obviously gotten a lot of media attention for her role as sort of the one of the top MAGA Republicans in the House. So if she loses, how much that says about gun policy would be up in for debate. It'd be another thing you look at and say, well, she made gun policy a big part of her brand, but also she was, extremely in your face sort of MAGA personality. Maybe that didn't fit her district as well as people thought. Yeah. I just to underline, it's not all that simple.
Well, there's a lot of moving parts. I'm curious, you might know this, Stephen. Can we anticipate seeing some exit polling or some polling after the election to ask people, hey, you voted for this person or that person in New York? What were your top 3 or 5 major issues, to see if maybe the gun, to kind of gauge where people's heads are on guns and how important that issue is to them one way or the other?
Yeah. The exit polling will usually ask about issues just like your opinion polling does. And so exit polling is really only useful after it's been, matched up to the actual results of the election, right? Because you can do exit polling, but it's not as reliable of a form of polling as like your randomized blind, opinion polling, and even those are obviously not perfectly reliable either,
right?
Because exit polling relies on people being willing to talk to you as they leave the
polling place, for sure,
right? And so it's a little more self-selective than your traditional randomized polling has been. And so that what they usually do is they'll wait until, obviously they'll talk about election. Everybody who watched any election coverage has seen them talk about exit polling, but the most reliable way to look at it is after it's been normalized to what the actual results of the election were. So because you can look at, all right, well, the people we talked to, 40% said they were for Fetterman and 60% said Oz. Obviously that's not how the election came out. So we have to match these numbers up to what the actual results were.
Right.
And that way we'll get a better understanding of what people were really thinking as in the overall electorate. So you'll get some more insight from that kind of stuff once all the results are in, and you can the pollsters can do those sorts of do that work.
All right, folks, it's been a long episode. If you hung in this far, do me a favor. If you're on Spotify, go leave us a 5-star rating. If you're on Apple Podcasts, go leave us a 5-star rating and a review. And if you've made it this far, please use the word Gutowski. It's Gutowski. He is the founder of TheReload.com and a host of the Weekly Reload podcast. Go give them a look. Steven counts on your membership dollars to fund his important work. So, Steven, I appreciate you coming on. We'll probably know a bit more next week. I might touch on this again when I see you next week.
Yeah, absolutely.